Today we're here to talk about the TPACK framework, of course. But just what is that? And as quickly as possible, TPACK is a framework that characterizes what teachers need to know in order to teach with technology. It suggests that teachers need to know about technology, about content or subject matter, and pedagogy or teaching strategies, not just separately, but also about how these three things interact and influence one another in unique and specific contexts. In terms of teaching with technology, it suggests that technology not only changes how we teach, but also what we teach. In a nutshell, that's the TPACK framework as we know it today in 2017. And this image has come to represent how people recognize the TPACK framework. Both the image and the framework are cited a lot. They guide a lot of research and data analyses. And the TPACK framework has been picked up by a lot of organizations, including CITE, and supported by tpack.org website, a Facebook group, and TPACK SIG and more. So what's left to talk about? Well, I've decided to talk today and present a story of how and why the TPACK image that we know and love today came to be. And in storytelling, it's sometimes easy to reduce a story to a simpler format, a linear story that has a conflict and a resolution, and that's exactly what I'm going to do here. But keep in mind that the reality is the story was a lot messier. There are lots of subplots and threads that never get resolved. And after I present my simple version of the story, I'll try to go back and fill in some of the trickier parts. So here's the simple version of that story. Every story needs a setting, and this story begins way back in the year 2000. Remember way back then? We, like a lot of people, were seriously thinking about the intersection of technology and education in general. And specifically, we were studying what teachers needed to know about educational technology. And in the year 2000, it was the right time for something like this. As this research tree shows, there were many other people who were working on similar ideas, pre-TPACK ideas, and also thinking about the relationship between technology, pedagogy, and content. It was a good time to be thinking about these things. Every story also needs some characters, and there were actually a lot of people involved in this story. But in this oversimplified version, I focus on two. Punya Mishra on the right and me on the left. If you notice, I had a lot more hair back in 2000, and it wasn't gray. And fun fact, every story needs some conflict, and these two characters didn't hit it off right away. They were just a little bit too different. But like in most good stories, it wasn't until later on in the plot that they learned how these differences made their collaboration and friendship stronger and how to work together. Also, every story needs a good plot. And in this story, the plot is about how we settled on what teachers needed to know and how that became reflected in the components of the TPACK framework. So, in chapter 1 of our story, which took place in the year 2000, these two characters didn't agree on a lot, but we did agree on two things. We agreed that technology was currently taught as a separate skill to teachers that was often divorced from their other understandings of teaching. We both agreed that this was a pretty bad idea. We also agreed on our shared love of learning by design, that all sorts of good things happen by designing and building things, including technological things. So we agreed to work together in reshaping some of our master's level courses experiences around these ideas. In chapter 2 of this story, we worked hard on using these design-based experiences to teach educational technology to teachers and faculty. We had group work in teams and had mixed membership of faculty, graduate students, and teachers all working to build things, like websites, PowerPoints, videos, and even online courses. Some team members brought technical expertise, some brought content expertise, and some teaching expertise. In chapter 3, we studied very hard to understand what teachers and faculty were learning when doing these activities. We started to publish what we found and how we were thinking about it. And our earliest formulation was that teachers were beginning to see relationships between content, pedagogy, and technology, like you might expect, but also representation. Our thinking was that the same idea could be represented on pen or paper, in video, in simulation, on a screen, and this was a separate issue from content, pedagogy, or technology. And because Punya loved tetrahedrons, he insisted on this formulation. In one of our earliest studies, for example, we started to look for these 4 types of knowledge in the websites that teens were creating. or in tracking the topics of conversation that design teams were having. But strangely enough, we couldn't get the idea of representation to work in the data. Too often representation was a matter of the technology used to render that representation, or a matter of what content idea was being depicted. Punya and I fought and fought and fought about whether or not to keep representation in the model. But eventually, we agreed that the data was ruining our theory, and we learned to listen to our data, and that representation just had to go. So in 2003, we made our first real precursor to the TPCK model, complete with our first published TPCK diagram, which appeared in print. Nobody, and I mean nobody, read or cited it or really cared. The problem is that we were trying to describe all the exciting stuff that happened when technology, content, and pedagogy interacted with one another. In this diagram, that means all the exciting stuff was happening in the lines. But in this representation, it's clear that the main important things to look for are content, pedagogy, and technology, and the lines seem to indicate some simple connections. Nothing exciting ever happened in a line. So in chapter 4 in our story, we make an important breakthrough. Punya excitedly came to me with a new representation he was working on. And we have our first appearance of circles, with an attempt to label and draw prominence to those important interactions. In 2005, we derive a representation that puts those interactions on the same level as the other bodies of knowledge, instead of just lines between circles. And we get our first use of overlapping circles, and we publish this as a TPCK framework in an AERA paper, and submit it as an overarching article, the Teacher's College Record, that includes this image. That article gets published in 2006. People read it, people like it, people see what we're talking about, and those interactions really resonate with people. It took a while, 6 versions of our figure, but we felt like we finally not only understood something, but also how to represent and communicate it. Due in part to a pretty gifted visual artist in the form of Punya Mishra. In chapter 5 of our story, AACTE steps in after the 2006 publication of our Teacher's College Record article with the plan of developing a TPCK handbook for educators. In planning this book that had so many different authors, working in so many diverse contexts, it became clear that context needed to be addressed more explicitly in the model. While it was true that we always address context in the text of our articles, it wasn't in the figure. So in 2007 and 2008, here we try to portray context as this non-rigid and somewhat permeable and shifting boundary outside of CPT. And it was important to do so that the important context gets conveyed in the image, by that time which is also synonymous with the framework. It's important that the image convey as much information as succinctly and accurately as possible, and that includes context. In chapter 6 of our story, we address another important problem of communication. Nobody could pronounce the framework, and it was getting hard to share or talk about it. So at the NTLS conference one year, there was literally a contest to rename the TPCK framework. And the winning name entry was the most modest, but also the most elegant solution, to add an A and make TPCK into TPACK, and call it the Technological and Pedagogical and Content Knowledge Framework. A simple act of making TPACK pronounceable impacted the spread and influence of the framework, which is somewhat funny because Punya and I were somewhat reluctant at first to rename it, but now, of course, full-heartedly endorse it. We learned again the importance of soliciting and listening to feedback. And in our final chapter of our simplified story, we now have the familiar figure that we use today. Contexts are represented slightly differently, and TPCK is now TPACK. And this image is freely distributed rights-free for scholars to use in their articles on tpack.org. Now, everything in this simplified story was true, but it's not complete. The real story, as I said earlier, was more complex. There's a lot more going on in the past, present, and future of TPACK research than I could reasonably cover. But let me highlight what some of those big missing story threads and themes were, and will continue to be in TPACK research. The first important thread or theme to consider is the role of assessing TPACK. Assessing teachers' knowledge was an instrumental part in allowing us to go from this to this. Artifacts, discourse analysis, and surveys were all important sources of data in helping us decide what the data could and could not support. There have been significant issues, challenges, and successes along the way in the efforts to measure and assess TPACK, and continue to confront these issues is an important part of future TPACK research, and will continue to be part of the ongoing story of TPACK. Two more important threads that need to be further developed is in-service and pre-service teacher education. Now, our efforts have focused primarily on in-service teacher development, and these efforts have focused primarily on one approach, learning technology by design. The idea that TPACK could be developed by having teachers build educational technology and confront content, pedagogy, and technology all at the same time. But there's a much wider lens on teacher development that spans many more approaches in both pre and in-service settings. And as the TPACK story continues to be told, the roles of pre and in-service teacher education will have prominent roles in that story. Another growing thread of TPACK research is the role of TPACK in higher education contexts, including the professional development of professors and administrators. In our own work, we have always seen the importance of developing TPACK in higher education settings. Many of our first design teams included College of Education faculty members, and the task was to develop online courses. The goal was to develop TPACK within those faculty members as they built their first online courses. It is in these higher education contexts that we first developed and refined the TPACK framework. A lot has happened since those early days, and the important role that higher education plays in the ongoing story of TPACK is paramount. And the last thread or theme missing in this story is the role of disrupting the framework itself. Since the very beginning of the TPACK framework has not been static or fixed. It has been a growing, evolving framework that has changed to better fit the data, to better communicate, and better support the various audiences for the framework. By its very nature, it has evolved and will continue to evolve. Many other researchers have suggested improvements, alternative conceptions, or additions to the model, as they should, and they've applied it to other contexts than in-service, pre-service, and higher education. These efforts to evolve and disrupt the TPACK framework continue today and into the future, both continuing the TPACK story and writing new stories. In conclusion, today I told you the story of how the TPACK framework, and in particular the TPACK image, came to be. That's the story about how we saw the important roles that technology, pedagogy, and content had to play as they interact with one another, and how we represented those understandings over time. But there's a lot more to say about TPACK and the work around TPACK that continues today. I didn't have time to tell you everything, as the story is a complex one, it's still an evolving one, and involves many more people who have a lot more stories to tell. Thank you.